In just 6 years, one single conflict completely redrew the map of the world. It swallowed up entire nations, and it gave us a weapon that changed humanity forever. So today, we're going to try to unpack the story of the Second World War, from its really bitter roots to its absolutely world-shattering end.
But before we dive in, I want you to just look at this number. Let it sink in for a second. Somewhere between 70 and 85 million people died. That's about 3% of the entire planet's population at the time. This wasn't just another war. It was by far the deadliest conflict in all of human history. And really, you've got to understand that staggering human cost to get a grip on everything else that happened.
So, how on earth did the world get dragged into a catastrophe like this, just 20 years after what was supposed to be the war to end all wars? Well, the awful irony is that the end of World War I, it didn't really bring peace. Instead, it brought a ton of humiliation and resentment, and it planted the perfect seeds for an even worse war. And the path from one war to the next was just shockingly fast. It all starts with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. It forced Germany to take all the blame for the First War and pay these absolutely crushing reparations. This created this deep national shame, and, it totally wrecked their economy. It was the perfect storm for a charismatic and frankly vengeful guy like Adolf Hitler to come along. By 33, he's in charge. By 38, he's already grabbing more land, and other aggressive powers like Italy and Japan are lining up with him. The world was on a collision course, and everybody could see it coming.
So faced with all this aggression, what did the other big powers do? Well, they tried a policy called appeasement. You see, Britain and France were desperate to avoid another horrible war, so they kept giving in to Hitler, hoping he'd eventually just be satisfied. They let him have Austria, they gave him parts of Czechoslovakia. But here's the thing, it didn't calm him down. It just made him think he could get away with anything.
So, feeling like he could do no wrong, Hitler and his Axis partners unleashed their new war machine on the world. And that first phase of the war was just this shocking display of speed and power that caught the Allies completely, totally flat-footed. The German strategy was called Blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. And it was exactly that. This was not the slow, grinding trench warfare from World War I. No way. This was all about speed. You'd have these concentrated waves of tanks, planes, and soldiers, all working together perfectly to just punch through enemy lines, create total chaos, and surround them. Using this tactic, Poland was conquered in just 27 days. Okay, so with Poland gone, Germany turned its attention to the west. But France felt pretty safe. They had this thing called the Maginot Line, a massive, high-tech string of forts all along the German border. It was supposed to be a defensive masterpiece, absolutely unbreakable. But the Germans didn't even try to break it. In this incredibly gutsy move, they just went around the whole thing. They punched right through a forest in Belgium that everyone thought was impassable. The French and British armies were completely blindsided, pushed all the way back to the sea, and trapped at a place called Dunkirk. In what was basically a miracle, over 330,000 of them were rescued by a ragtag fleet of Navy ships and regular people in their fishing boats. But still, France fell. So with France gone, Britain was all alone. Hitler got ready to invade and launch this huge air war, the Battle of Britain, to try and wipe out the Royal Air Force. But fired up by their new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, the British people just refused to give in. The RAF pilots fought like heroes and held off the German Air Force, forcing Hitler to put his invasion on hold forever. That survival, that was a massive, massive turning point. Britain holding on was really the first crack in the Axis' unstoppable image, and it was the start of a huge shift in the war. For a while, the Axis powers had seemed invincible, but a couple of absolutely catastrophic mistakes on opposite sides of the globe were about to stop them in their tracks. On June 22, 1941, Hitler made what was probably his biggest mistake of the entire war. He launched Operation Barbarossa, a surprise invasion of the Soviet Union with more than 3 million soldiers. He thought it would be a quick win, and at first, they made incredible progress. But he underestimated two huge things: just how big Russia is and the brutal Russian winter. The German war machine literally froze to a halt just a few miles outside of Moscow. And that lightning war? It turned into a slow, bloody, grinding fight that Germany just couldn't win. At the same time, half a world away, another Axis power made its own fateful gamble. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. President Franklin Roosevelt famously called it a date which will live in infamy. And just like that, the industrial giant that was the United States was officially in the war. Now, between 42 and 43, the entire war pivoted on two gigantic battles. Out on the Eastern Front, the German army hit a brick wall at Stalingrad. I mean, in one of the bloodiest battles in all of history, the Soviets surrounded and completely wiped out the German Sixth Army. It was a disaster Germany never recovered from. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, American codebreakers figured out Japan's plan to attack a little island called Midway. So the U.S. Navy set a trap and sank 4 of Japan's key aircraft carriers, basically crippling their navy for good. These two victories, thousands of miles apart, they really were the beginning of the end for the Axis. All right, so the tide has clearly turned. The Allies have the momentum, and they're ready to take the fight right back to the Axis. It was time to launch the final offensive and finally liberate Europe. And that final push began on June 6, 1944, D-Day. Just look at these numbers. The Allies launched the biggest seaborne invasion in the history of the world, period. You had 156,000 soldiers hitting the beaches of Normandy in France, with 5,000 ships on the sea and 13,000 planes in the sky. The casualties were horrific, but they did it. They got a foothold, and the Western Front was finally open. In the winter of 44, Hitler threw one last desperate haymaker. It's known as the Battle of the Bulge. German forces actually managed to surround an American division in the town of Bastogne. When the German commander sent a message demanding that they surrender, the American general, Anthony McAuliffe, sent back a legendary one-word reply: nuts. The Americans held their ground, the German attack failed, and the road to Berlin was now wide open. So with the Allies pushing from the west and the Soviets storming in from the east, the German war machine just completely fell apart. On April 30th, 1945, with the sound of Soviet shells exploding right above his head, Adolf Hitler took his own life in his Berlin bunker. A little over a week later, on May 8th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. But winning in Europe wasn't the end of the whole story. Over in the Pacific, Japan was still fighting, and fighting with incredible determination. And the world was about to enter a new and, honestly, terrifying new age. This was the brutal question staring Allied leaders right in the face. A traditional invasion of Japan was expected to cost maybe 1 million Allied lives and millions more Japanese lives. They were up against an enemy who would rather die than surrender. So what do? Well, they turned to a secret weapon, the result of the top-secret Manhattan Project. On August 6, 1945, the city of Hiroshima was vaporized by a single atomic bomb. 3 days after that, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The level of destruction was something the world had just never seen before. Faced with this unimaginable new power and a declaration of war from the Soviet Union, Japan finally agreed to surrender. The official surrender ceremony took place on the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. And just like that, after 6 long years and 1 day, the most destructive war in human history was finally over. But its impact on the world was really just beginning. The world that emerged from the ashes was profoundly different. For one, the full horror of the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews, came to light, leading to new international laws and the Nuremberg trials for crimes against humanity. The United Nations was created, hoping to stop something like this from ever happening again. But at the same time, the war created 2 new superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, which kicked off the Cold War. Old empires started to fall apart, and the entire planet now lived under the shadow of nuclear war. And that really brings us to the final critical question. The war taught us some incredibly hard lessons. That giving in to extremism is a disaster, that hate-fueled nationalism leads to absolute horror, and that our ability to create new technology can easily outrun our wisdom. So the question it leaves us with is one we really have to keep asking ourselves every single day. Have we actually learned anything?